Boldwood presents The Lover, written by Amanda Brookfield and read by Deryn Edwards. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. 1998. Chapter 1. At Francis's insistence, there were to be no black ties. The service would be a celebration of Paul's life. A successful, happy, astonishingly trouble-free half-century that had culminated in the most wonderful, not to say timely, party just a couple of weeks before his death. Thanks to that, there were even 2 cases of champagne to get the wake off to a good start. Afterwards they could move on to the Volnay he had taken such pleasure in choosing during their holiday in France earlier that summer. Paul would approve wholeheartedly. He always liked a good party. The more Francis said such things, the easier it became. As well as being true, such platitudes acted as crutches to help her through each day and deterred people from asking how she felt. No amount of kindness on the part of the inquirer could make up for the fact that Francis had no coherent view on her feelings, let alone any concept of how to articulate them. To die of a heart attack on a tennis court was not an end anyone could have predicted, least of all for a man with a natural appetite for moderation, a man for whom the term close shave applied solely to the activity of his razor. In terms of recent health scares, Francis could recollect nothing beyond a bad cough that had clung on into the spring and an infected mosquito bite, which had required a course of mild antibiotics. Being so suddenly deprived of him felt like waking up and finding a limb had been removed in the night. There was the shock of it, the feeling that he was still there, the pain of imagining he was. While friends and family seemed to derive some measure of consolation from the fact that Paul had died while indulging in one of his favourite pastimes, it was an aspect of the situation which gave Frances herself little comfort. A part of her could not help thinking that there was something undignified, comical even, about dying in pursuit of a forehand. Though unable yet to say such things out loud, she could feel them pressing at the edges of her grief, confusing it. Just as her indifference to Paul's departure for the club that Sunday morning confused her, making her long to be able to lay claim to an inkling of a presentiment. The sheer mundanity of their behaviour during what turned out to be the last hours of their marriage made her almost ashamed. They had exchanged a kiss on the doorstep, but perfunctorily, without thought or tenderness. She couldn't even remember their exact last exchange of words. It was not only sad, but inadequate. It made her wish that humans could write the script for their own endings, so that they could be approached with grace and preparation, like wedding anniversaries and christenings. Which was precisely why people had funerals, Frances reflected grimly, clenching her jaw as Felix stepped up behind the lectern, his fine, pale features flexed with the effort of managing his own emotions. To pay a public tribute to his father had been entirely his idea. His way, Frances supposed, of putting the seal of peace on what recently, anyway, had not always been the most harmonious of relationships. Daisy, more weepy than Frances herself, had been half appalled and half admiring of her younger brother's determination in the matter. "I won't be able to talk to anyone, let alone proclaim anything moving or clever from the pulpit. I'm dreading it, seeing everybody, knowing that they're staring at you, feeling sorry for you. It's unspeakable." "It won't be so bad," Frances murmured, stroking her daughter's cropped mop of bleached hair. "People will be there to offer support, to show how much they liked and respected your father, and to see how much you cry, and whether you're coping or cracking up. I know, because I'm like that too, curious about other people's misery. We all are." She seized a fresh tissue from the box which had taken up permanent residence on the kitchen table, and left the room. "Leave her," growled Felix, seeing his mother push back her chair. Frances had sunk back into her seat with a sigh. As with the glib responses she had been spouting for friends, some part of her was aware that she was merely going through the motions of offering comfort to her children. The truth was, she felt too numb to offer anything. It took all her strength to walk through the course of each day, to open her eyes at dawn and maintain the pretense of being conscious and sane until an hour respectable enough to swallow one of the Valium tablets prescribed to her by Dr. Liam. While Felix addressed the congregation, Frances clutched Daisy's bony hand, inwardly longing for some of the protective, numbing gauze that helped her drift off to sleep each night. Although with his head of sandy fair hair and delicate features, he had always looked much more like her, his voice was uncannily like his father's. Even the way his eyes flicked nervously between his script and the congregation reminded her of Paul. Cautious but fundamentally confident, modest but ultimately sure of his place in the world. Although barely 18, Felix was just a couple of weeks from taking up a place at university. In many ways, he already seemed much more mature than his 20-year-old sister, who had dropped out of art college the year before in order to move to Paris with an art dealer boyfriend called Claude, to whom the family had barely been introduced. Frances swallowed hard in a vain attempt to dislodge a new lump blocking the back of her throat. Worrying about Daisy had been very much a shared burden, jointly taken up during the year their carefree, freckled 12-year-old metamorphosed into a creature filled with enough self-revulsion to want to starve herself into non-existence. Without Paul, she wasn't sure they would all have weathered the crisis as they did. He was always better at remaining calm, the one who stepped back and was rational, the weight of common sense that kept her rooted to the ground. The image of Felix blurred. Frances's cheekbones and jaw were beginning to ache with the effort of not crying, of keeping her mouth still and closed. Inside she could feel a howling, a swelling of private sound pushing to get out. She tried to focus on the coffin, but could think only how small it looked, how absurd it was that Paul's impressive 6-foot physique could fit inside. If Daisy's hand had not remained clenched round hers, she would have slid to the edge of the pew and raced out of the church and run till her heart burst. A celebration of life, indeed. Who had she been trying to fool? Outside in the fresh September air, the urge to howl receded. As the coffin was lowered into the plot, an orderly rectangle dug into the large, well-groomed graveyard backing onto St. Martin's Church, Frances felt brave enough to glance along the semicircle of solemn faces on either side of her. Paul's younger brother, Thomas, was standing ashen-faced, the palms of both hands resting on the shoulders of his youngest son. The child looked as mournful as his father, but self-consciously so, as if determined to prove equal to the adult emotional demands of the occasion. Next to them, Thomas's wife, her eyes masked by stylish black sunglasses, filled nervously with a crumpled handkerchief. In the row behind was Frances's own sister Carol, who had kindly flown over from New York. In high black heels, she towered above the other women, the picture of pallid composure, her arm linked authoritatively through their mothers. It was only at such times that not being a close family mattered, Frances reflected, casting around for a face that offered more reassurance, and lighting upon Alistair and Libby Taverner, clustered together at the back, with their 4 teenaged children. Their 2 families had met and become friendly 10 years before, during the first few months after the Copelands moved to the country. While Alistair and Paul had enjoyed manly bonding over the delights of trout fishing and a potent local brew of real ale, Frances's and Libby's fondness for one another had blossomed out of the more practical challenges of motherhood and school runs. Since the Taverner's ramshackle farmhouse was only a couple of miles away, on the other side of Leybourne, friendships among the children had flourished for a time as well, until divergent interests and activities took them down separate paths. Sensing she was being watched, Libby glanced up and offered Frances a tight smile of encouragement. Ashes to ashes, and dust to dust. Even their hermit of a neighbour had turned up, Frances observed, touched in spite of herself at the sight of Joseph Brackman hovering awkwardly in the background, his sallow, unkempt features shrouded under the protective hood of his green anorak. When she looked again, he was already dodging through the gravestones back to the main path. "You're doing so well," murmured Libby, putting her arm across Frances's shoulders for the walk back to the cars. "Are you sure you want people to come to the house? I mean, if you're not up to it, I could easily—" "No, of course they must. Daisy and I have been up since dawn making sandwiches. Gave us something to do," she added with an attempt at a brave smile. "And there's all that champagne from the party. Paul would have wanted us to make merry." Her voice tailed off, defeated by the sense that at last even the platitudes were running out of steam. "It's an amazing turnout," said Libby gently. "You should be very proud. And Paul would have been proud of you, the way you're getting through it, all three of you." Frances turned to check on the progress of Daisy and Felix, who were walking arm in arm behind. At the sight of them, tucked so closely together, looking sombre and adult, she felt such a twist of protective love and terror that she almost groaned out loud. A few mourners had taken the precaution of bringing brollies, but there was no need. Where grey skies during the previous few days had led to rainy afternoons, on this occasion the sun broke through, just as most of the congregation were manoeuvring their cars off the muddy grass verge opposite the church gate. It was late September, at its most alluring, filled with the lush green legacy of a long wet summer, yet already heavy with the impending full arrival of autumn. It would be dry enough to use the garden, Frances realised with some relief, staring glassy-eyed out of the window as the long black car, provided by the undertakers, cruised round the narrow country lanes, its engine purring like a predatory beast. With so many guests, it was impossible not to be reminded of the party. They had used the garden then, too, decked the branches of the apple trees with multicoloured lights and positioned flame torches to mark the edges of the path and the perimeter fence separating the bottom of the garden from the path down to the river. The area of grass nearest the fence had been so boggy that Paul had placed several rows of wooden planks by way of a false floor to minimise the amount of dirt being trailed through the house and to preclude the possibility of lost or ruined party shoes. The river was so full that for the first time that either of them could remember, it was lapping right up to the edge of the path itself, only a few yards from the garden gate. The cellar, in spite of the expensive water-protective treatment injected into its walls a couple of years before, had flooded again, so badly that all Paul's precious wine stocks had to be moved upstairs to the spare bedroom. A live jazz band, housed in a small marquee along with several round dining tables, had been one of the many memorable touches to the evening. The players performed tirelessly, providing a subdued serenade through supper, and then raising the pace and volume once the furniture had been pushed back for dancing. Paul, an eager performer, whenever the moment called, had led Frances by the tips of her fingers to the centre of the boarded floor, where he began jiving round her, much as he had at their wedding party 21 years before, ducking and swaying to the clapping encouragement of onlooking guests. Frances, moving as always with more reserve, had clapped too, happy for her husband to take the spotlight, happy to see him happy. It was his night. His swan song, as it turned out. Aided considerably by the necessity of distributing food, Frances managed to circulate amongst the mourners, accepting compliments about the service and offers of help. Anything we can do. Anything at all. But what? She wanted to ask. What could anyone possibly do? When the impulse to voice such retorts out loud grew dangerously strong, she dumped her triangular wholemeal egg and cress offerings on the hall table next to Carol's huge, still unwrapped bouquet of lilies, and fled upstairs to the sanctity of the spare room. She was sitting on the bed, winding the tasselled hem of the counterpane round her fingers, and sadly contemplating the case of vintage port which Paul had been saving for Daisy's 21st, when Libby appeared in the doorway, holding out a mug of tea. "Drink this. I've put in a spoonful of sugar for energy. You'll faint if you're not careful." Frances dabbed at her eyes with the counterpane and accepted the drink gratefully. 43 doesn't feel old enough to be a widow. "It isn't. It's hateful and unfair." "I always thought 7 years was a bit of a gap. I mean, I did wonder whether it would come to matter at some stage, whether Paul might go gaga like his mother somewhere in the run-up to 80, while I, a mere sprightly 70-year-old, would end up devoting the last few years of our married life to wiping dribbles from his chin and helping him shuffle to the loo." She broke off to let out a laugh, which somehow transformed itself to a sob. "I just never thought—" Libby squeezed her arm. "None of us did. We're all in shock. I mean, just at the party, just 2 weeks ago, I thought so many times how well he looked, how young and energetic for his age. And it wasn't just me. Loads of people said things about how fit he was, joking about it." "Drink your tea," murmured Libby, hoping she did not sound as at a loss as she felt inside. Paul Copeland had indeed been a model 50-year-old, an amiable country solicitor who enjoyed the pleasures of life without taking them to excess. Libby's own husband, Alistair, a 44-year-old self-employed architect, had for years been under far more daily stress than ever seemed to afflict the Copelands. Whereas Paul's small practice had seemed impervious to the vagaries of the economy, Alistair was still reeling from the most recent recession. Without Libby's own enterprise, a gift shop on the outskirts of Hexford with a maddeningly fluctuating profit margin, and Charlie and Beth's music scholarships, they would long since have floundered in deep financial distress. Arrested by this particular train of thought, she found herself blurting, "Are you all right for money? I mean, don't they freeze everything for a while? Probate and so on?" "They do, but I'm fine. Heaps of the bloody stuff. We'd just transferred some savings for a down payment on converting the garage, which I've cancelled now, of course. All Alistair's lovely drawings." Frances broke off to take a swig of tea, scowling at the sweetness, but swallowing like a dutiful child. "From what I can gather, I'll get some kind of lump sum, and also Paul's pension. And we'd already put aside the money for Felix to go to university." She managed a wry smile. "From the point of view of being well looked after, I couldn't have asked for more." Seeing that she was on the verge of tears again, and wanting to distract her, Libby leant across to study the 2 pencil sketches of Daisy and Felix which hung above the bed. "I love these. They ought to be downstairs instead of skulking up here where no one ever gets to appreciate them." Frances shook her head, muttering, "The children would be embarrassed to have their mother's etchings of their formative years on public display. The sight of them always makes me feel guilty for somehow never having the time to get out my pencils and start on—" The sentence hung, incomplete, between the 2 women, ensnared in the harsh truth of Frances's new circumstances. The days of Paul appearing home 4 days out of 5 in the hope of a bowl of homemade soup for lunch were over. There was no longer anybody to cook for each evening, no shirts with fiendish double cuffs to iron. Soon there would not even be Felix, who preferred to wear his clothes as crumpled as possible, but who nevertheless made considerable demands on the fridge and washing machine. Adjusting to his impending absence was something Frances had been dreading anyway. She would even miss the muffled thump of his music, the one apparently vital accoutrement to the business of revising for A-levels, which had driven his father, for whom silence had always been a prerequisite for mental exertion of any kind, into paroxysms of anger. Remembering the rows earlier in the year, Frances flinched and shut her eyes. Thinking of the bad times felt too disloyal. I suppose I'd better go back downstairs, she said, not moving. Libby crossed to the window and stared out with a sigh. I think it might be going to rain after all. Frances left the bed and went to stand beside her. For a moment, both women studied the sombrely clad groups arranged on the lawn below. The plea for no black ties had been largely ignored. Daisy's white blonde head stood out like a beacon, as did Felix's bright red tie. They were talking to guests, but still standing next to each other in a show of mutual support. The children are being wonderful, said Frances, biting her lip. How long is Daisy staying? The rest of the week, I think. Her plans, as ever, are hazy. She says she wants me to go and stay with her and Claude, but I don't think she means it. Frances stared at the subsiding mountain of old grass clippings, concealed from general view between the garden shed and the end fence. Cutting the lawn had been one of Paul's favourite weekend chores. His birthday present that year had been an expensive 4-wheel mower, the size of a small tractor. For the ageing gardener, Frances had teased, watching him open the small wrapped parcel that contained the ignition keys. He had used it once, just before the party, steering it with all the glee of a small boy, leaning out at the corners as if the garden were a Formula One circuit instead of a 1-acre rectangle with a few trees. If Daisy's asked you, you should go. Maybe. And when's Felix off? He starts in 2 weeks. At least it's Sussex, and not Edinburgh. It's only an hour away. An hour and 3/4. Well, that's nothing, concluded Libby brightly, as if a 43-year-old mother could expect to commute to her son's student digs every other day of the week, in search of distraction and entertainment. And that children's charity you're always helping, she continued, a little desperately now. No doubt they'll be making their usual heavy demands. They're always frantic after the summer, aren't they? Oh, yes, always. Frances drained the last of her tea. Help me get rid of them all, will you? I've had enough. Chapter 2. The moment the guests had gone, Frances wished she could summon them all back. Surrounding herself with Paul's friends felt suddenly like the surest testimony to his worth, to the fact that he had existed at all. The last to leave were Libby and Alistair, who had stayed on with all 4 children to help clear up. Call whenever you want, said Libby, winding down the car window. Day or night? Promise me you will. I promise, Frances lied, knowing from the glimpses of despair she had suffered already that communication of any kind felt impossible and pointless, let alone dawn phone calls to sleep-deprived friends. Soon after the taverner's mud-spattered Volvo had disappeared from sight, Felix announced his intention to go on a walk, warning that he might be quite a while and no one was to worry. Daisy, looking spectral, the smudges of her mascara having merged into the dark circles under her eyes, complained of a headache and the need to lie down. For something to do, feeling abandoned and blank with sadness, Frances dragged herself round the garden, touring Paul's treasured flower beds. They were still bulging with colour, but she walked with unseeing eyes, absently bending down to retrieve the occasional escaped paper napkin and forgotten wine glass. The tedium and exhaustion of grief were unexpected, and like nothing she had ever known. When her father died 10 years before, there had been as much relief as sadness. Watching the only member of her family to whom she had ever felt close succumb to the pain and indignities of prostate cancer had made her long for the end. While her mother, never one for indulging in emotions at the best of time, had responded to bereavement by joining another book club, redecorating the house and embarking on the first of many subsequent package holidays with widowed friends. At the thought of her mother, Frances sighed. They had spoken a little after the funeral, but the truth was she had been thankful that Carol had been there to deflect most of the attention. They were much more alike, the pair of them. both filled with a frenetic energy which Frances neither shared nor trusted, suspecting its origins to lie with an urge to dodge life rather than look it squarely in the eye. At the garden gate she stopped and stared down towards the River Lea, shrunk now to its original proportions, glinting silver through the trees in a last burst of afternoon sun. The land separating the end of their garden from the riverbank was part of a public bridle path. Next to it lay several acres of farmland, which were usually given over to daffodils or rapeseed, providing a vivid yellow backdrop to the sandstone of the house and the kaleidoscopic beauty of the garden. To have such an uncluttered view of the Kent countryside was a privilege, Frances knew, and one that had been a prime factor in their decision to purchase the house 10 years before. With the children, then 8 and 11, it had also been an ideal time to move to the country, away from the prison of small gardens and schools that required negotiation with the South Circular. Paul had also been eager to move from the enormous, prestigious London practice in which he had mastered his trade into a more personal setup, where he could enjoy an easier ride up a shorter, less greasy pole. In fact, the only reservations about abandoning their 3-bedroomed Edwardian house had come from Frances herself. Her parents lived in Chiswick, and it was during the period that her father was very ill. While this provided an excuse for her reluctance, Frances had been aware that it in fact went much deeper. Weekend sorties to friends already ensconced in various rural cul-de-sacs within the commuter belt of the home counties had never convinced her that it was a lifestyle with which she would feel any natural affinity. Contentment had come with time and a little determination. Early resolutions to keep a foothold in London, to pop up by train for social and cultural excursions, were soon put to one side. Missing Clapham Common and the Barbican proving unhelpful emotions for a woman whose children loved screaming round muddy fields and whose husband fished and liked to cycle to the local tennis club. Frances was wrested from her reverie by an icy sensation in her toes. She looked down to see her smart black shoes almost submerged in mud. She stood quite still, studying the soggy ground, aware that she was slowly, imperceptibly sinking into it. For a mad moment, she found herself embracing the sensation, drawn to the notion that the world would obligingly swallow someone who had had enough of it, that she might sink without trace and avoid the black tunnel of readjustment stretching ahead. A glimpse of Joseph Brackman's green anorak through the trees stirred her to her senses. Terrified at the prospect of having to make conversation, she quickly stepped out of sight, the earth squelching its reluctance to release her feet. Back inside the house, she found Daisy sitting at the kitchen table in front of a glass of wine, both hands busy with her tobacco pouch. "Headache better?" Frances filled the kettle, more for something to do than because she felt like a drink. "A bit." Daisy pulled out a square of thin white paper and began deftly filling it with shreds of tobacco. There were faint yellow nicotine stains towards the ends of the index and third fingers of her right hand, which Frances did not remember seeing before. She watched as Daisy sucked deeply on her creation, flattening one end of the paper between her lips. "By the way, I've been meaning to tell you, I've got a job." "A job? But that's marvellous. You should have said something earlier." Daisy picked a fleck of tobacco off her lower lip. "It's hardly been the right time, and it's only helping out in a gallery 3 days a week. It's a nice gallery, though, a good one. Lots of modern stuff. Claude says it's the perfect place for meeting people, for making contacts for my own work, setting up exhibitions and so on." Although Frances did her best both to sound and appear enthusiastic, she was hampered by her own state of mind, and the fact that her daughter's future as an artist was something about which Daisy herself always sounded half convinced. Her decision the year before to leave college early had left both parents exasperated, particularly Paul. It had taken all Daisy's daddy's girl charm to win him round, to persuade him that Claude would be a far more effective nurturer and marketer of her talent than a second-rate art college. The move to Paris would prove the launch pad of her career, she had assured them excitedly, the place where everything would come together. Regarding the gaunt, pallid face of her daughter now across the table, her cheeks hollow with the effort of sucking the last thread of smoke from her cigarette, Frances was suddenly glad that Paul would be spared the disappointment of seeing Daisy's grand plans come to nothing. With both children, she had always been the better compromiser, the one who could settle for less and not mind. Working in a gallery will be good language practice too, she murmured, stirring her tea but feeling little inclination to drink it. And it'll mean I can help out with the rent and so on, Daisy pressed on. Get me away from being completely dependent on poor Claude. Not that he ever complains. He's incredibly generous. She stubbed out her cigarette. I did tell you, didn't I, how very much he wanted to be here today. A last-minute work thing blew up, an important deal that's going pear-shaped. He's desperately sorry about Dad, and has been very sweet to me, very understanding. I'm so glad. Frances tipped her untouched mug of tea down the sink and began returning dry wine glasses to the cardboard box of 36 that they had hired from the off-licence. She moved slowly, burdened by the sense that everything she said, every move she made, was being performed for the sake of it, that nothing derived from a genuine impulse towards action. Even breathing felt like a conscious act. It struck her then that grief, rather than being an emotion, was in fact an absence of the ability to feel, an absence of interest in the world or the self. Hard for anyone, let alone a woman who had never been particularly interested in herself anyway. Felix walked fast, his shoulders hunched, his head bent so that he had nothing to contemplate except the trail of puddles at his feet. After only 10 minutes or so, he began to feel a blister forming on his little toe. The boots were his father's, not only 2 sizes too big, but also damp from having been left forgotten next to the boot scraper outside the back door. Wearing them felt like necessary pain, the same necessary pain that had driven him to stand up in front of scores of people in church and to speak through gritted teeth about things he felt too confused to feel. Respect, admiration, gratitude. Things any normal 18-year-old son should want to say about a parent. Felix stopped at the humpback bridge over the river and checked his watch. After glancing round to make sure he was alone, he hopped over the lowest part of the bridge wall and scrambled down the steep incline towards the river. The water was moving so fast and furiously that for a moment he was almost afraid. Then, as his eyes accustomed themselves to the dim light under the bridge, he saw that the dry bank remained, less of it than usual, but still a good couple of yards in width. The blanket was where he had left it, folded into a neat square and tucked into a gap between 2 loose bricks. He shook it out, picking off bits of moss and leaf still attached from the last time. The ceilinged arch of stone was so low that when upright he had to keep his shoulders stooped so as not to bang his head. It was a relief to get the thing spread on the ground so that he could sit down and stretch his back and legs. He pulled a flattened pack of cigarettes from the back pocket of his trousers, noticing as he did so that a slight drizzle had started up outside. It was falling like a curtain of grey mist, screening nearly all the light from outside, in a way that made him feel both alone and yet wonderfully protected. 10 minutes later, when Felix had started playing guessing games with the hands of his watch, there was a faint rustle overhead, followed by the sound of someone slithering down the bank. So, I was getting worried. So was I. She stooped under the arch and dropped to her knees on the rug beside him. Dad said Sheba didn't need to be taken out. And what about giving poor Mum a hand with clearing up and making supper? And what did I want to walk for when it was about to rain anyway? Mum keeps bursting into tears and shoving Dad off when he tries to get near. Pete plugged himself back into the computer, like it was any other weekend. And Charlie shut himself and his oboe in his bedroom. The only good thing was Beth, who's been playing the angel ever since your dad died, and who said, of course, I might want to go on a walk at a time like this, and she'd help Mum with supper. Then she hugs Dad to shut him up. Sheba's allowed to stay in her basket, and suddenly I'm free." Felix stalled this rundown on events in the Taverner family by putting both arms round Sally's waist and pressing his tongue between her lips. They embraced for several minutes, displaying a fervour which 2 months of expression had done nothing to diminish. "You were brilliant this afternoon. Brilliant." Sally pulled back to study his face, running her nail-bitten fingers round the edge of his hairline. "So brave and strong, when inside you must have felt like shit." Felix swallowed. "It helped having you there, knowing you were on my side, that you understood." They kissed again, but less frantically, subsiding sideways until they were stretched full length on the rug. "Can we do it?" she murmured, pushing one of her skinny legs between his and moving her lips down to his neck. "I mean, I'll understand if you don't want to." "You've got to be kidding," he growled, pulling up her shirt and running his hands over the smooth flat of her belly. "Like I could ever not want to do it with you." Half tending to these new attentions, Sally reached out into a lower part of the wall and extracted a packet of prophylactics. "Only 2 left," she whispered in a giggle. "We'll have to stock up on supplies." She turned onto her back, closing her eyes. Felix slid her shirt off over her head and began running his tongue from her tummy button up between the still girlish wide flat space between her breasts. Sally opened her eyes and kissed the sandy waves of hair tickling her chin. Taking hold of his ears, she then pulled hard, forcing his face to come level with hers. Felix gave a playful yelp of pain. "Shh!" she scolded, laughing confidently, feeling more like 25 than 15, knowing that no one could hear them, with the drum of rain on the ground and the rush of water at their side. Chapter 3. "I just thought you might want to come too. There's loads of space. If you change your mind at the last minute, it's no problem. We'll be going anyway. Apart from Pete, who's off back to Bristol for the term, and Beth, who's going to stay the weekend with a friend. So it will just be Alistair, me, and the 2 younger ones." Seeing her husband trying to catch her eye, Libby waved him away furiously and turned her back. "I just thought it might be nice for you to have a break. Get away for a couple of days. The forecast isn't brilliant, but still it's in a lovely spot, right near some cliffs and a bit of rocky beach. Good for walking." Alistair crossed the kitchen and bent his face round and under his wife's so that she could no longer ignore him. "Leave her alone," he mouthed. Libby made a face and continued talking. She had only seen Frances once all week, on calling round with mushroom quiche and some fruit a couple of days after the funeral. She had looked thin and grey-faced, literally drained of energy. Even her lovely long fair hair had somehow lost its brilliance, hanging in flat untidy clumps over her back and shoulders. Daisy had already returned to Paris, and Felix was in Leybourne buying a few last-minute things for the start of his first term. She was driving him to Sussex the following morning, Frances had explained, humbly accepting the quiche and offering Libby a cup of coffee. She made one herself, but barely touched it, picking at the cuticles on her nails instead. The next day, Libby had telephoned to ask how Felix had settled in, only to find herself listening to Paul's voice on the answering machine. It gave her such a start that she burst into tears. If it were bad for her, stumbling across such poignant reminders, what must it be like for Frances, she had wondered, living with them surrounding her all the time? Almost more depressing was that since Paul's death, nothing had felt right in her own household either. While the children seemed bent upon discovering new ways of being hateful and awkward, Alistair was ploughing on with life as if no calamity had occurred at all. No one meeting him in the daily round would have had any inkling that one of their closest friends had dropped dead on a tennis court. In contrast, Libby found herself telling everybody, postmen, sales assistants, shop customers, and anyone else prepared to listen. Talking about the tragedy was the only way she had discovered of making herself feel any better. As well as allowing her to elicit sympathy on Frances's behalf, Scrutinising the facts from every angle somehow made them seem more acceptable. The more she tried to involve her husband in this process, however, the more determined he appeared to withdraw, to act as if nothing had happened, as if there were nothing to talk about. To such an extent that Libby had even caught herself wondering whether, in her own case, the premature death of a spouse would be such a bad thing after all. To be capable of such meanness bothered her. Alistair had been the one and only love of her life, and beneath the daily tussle of surviving 4 children and a large mortgage, she was sure she still adored him very deeply. Losing touch with the adoration happened from time to time, but not usually when she felt so emotionally battered and in need of all the spousal support she could get. The call to Frances inviting her to spend the weekend at a friend's cottage on the Isle of Wight had followed on from a largely unsatisfactory attempt to air some of these complicated grievances. As well as being obviously irritated at the suggestion that his own version of mourning was not demonstrative enough for his wife's more extravagant tastes, Alistair had voiced the upsetting opinion that Libby's eagerness to be supportive was dangerously close to pestering. Of course she won't want to come away for a jolly weekend with us. It needn't be jolly. Oh, well, in that case, why are we bothering to go at all? You know what I mean. No, I'm not sure I do. You seem to think that Frances being miserable under our scrutiny is better than allowing her to be miserable on her own, which is probably what she wants. I don't think she knows what she wants. I'm sure you're right, and it's up to us to give her the space to find out. I'm going to call anyway, just to ask, just to show we care. She knows we care, muttered Alistair, ramming dirty dinner plates into the dishwasher and angrily sweeping aside condiments and unused cutlery in order to create a space large enough to accommodate a set of plans on a loft conversion in Hythe. Thank you, Libby, said Frances firmly, but it feels too soon to go anywhere. It's very sweet of you to ask. But are you all right? Pressed Libby, feeling helpless and wanting reassurance for her own sake. Across the room, Alistair rolled his eyes at the ceiling. His wife turned back to the sink and pointedly stuck a finger in her ear. I mean, of course you're not all right, but are you coping? Frances stared out of the sitting-room window. 3 geese were streaking across the sky, black arrows on a white board, sharp, fast and focused. Watching them, she felt a twist of envy at the obvious clarity of their destination, their purposefulness. Coping? Yes, of course. Keeping busy, you know. She looked round the sitting room. Old papers lay strewn across the sofa. A blue sock of Felix's was poking out from under an armchair. Her tea mug from that morning was still sitting on the coffee table, gathering a fine head of white scum. Things she would normally have done without thinking, she no longer wanted to do. The hours, the days, her life, had lost their structure. The lethargy afflicting her was so crushing that sometimes she had to remind herself to blink. Libby hung up the kitchen phone, feeling unreassured but helpless. That Frances had reacted according to her husband's predictions did little to soften her feelings towards him. It'll take time, he said quietly, adding after a moment's pause, especially for a woman like Frances. What's that supposed to mean, a woman like Frances? Libby picked a bruised apple out of the fruit bowl and angrily plucked out the stalk. Alistair sighed, sensing conflict, but too sure of the veracity of his opinions to be deterred from expressing them. A woman who so clearly needs a man, whose entire life has been dictated by nothing but the humdrum demands of her family. She's always had other interests too, you know, like her drawing and helping out with those Feed the Children people. Alistair raised one eyebrow and made a pencil note of something in the top right-hand corner of the piece of paper in front of him. His silence communicated what Libby knew, but out of some perverse sense of loyalty was unwilling to acknowledge that while never in all their years of acquaintance appearing idle or inactive, Frances Copeland had never actually done very much beyond the modest demands of her small family. "I've only ever worked because we need the money." "No, you haven't." Alistair put down his pencil. "You work because your instincts for survival as an individual have always driven you to seek fulfillment outside the blissful womb of domesticity, which regularly threatens to throttle us. You've perfected your juggling act because it gives you satisfaction to do so, because you are the kind of woman who can happily exist within the stimuli of her own motivations, the kind of woman who, should she find herself bereaved, would have little trouble in picking up the pieces and carrying on. You don't need me, Libby. It's one of the things I find most attractive about you." Libby opened her mouth to speak, but closed it round the apple instead, disarmed and exasperated. "Frances needs a man," he continued. "Someone not only to look after, but also to define her. Her best hope is to meet someone else and begin again, which isn't to say that I don't feel enormous sympathy for her plight. I do." He picked up his pencil and tested the sharpness of the lead with his fingertip. "She is the very worst kind of person this could have happened to. And in case you have any doubt on the matter, I miss Paul enormously. He was a good man, a good friend." Having bitten into the bruise by mistake, Libby chewed and swallowed slowly. She hated her husband's calmness, his self-control, but admired him for it too. She was also secretly pleased at his image of her as so independent and capable. He had never said anything quite like that before, not in so many words. "So, Frances needs a new man," she murmured, going to sit opposite him at the table and placing both elbows on top of his papers so he had to look at her. "Actually, an old-fashioned one would suit her best," Alistair replied, smiling to show that he detected the softening in her attitude and welcomed it. And, of course, lots of support from her friends, too. "I know you want to help her, love." Libby reached forward and gently eased his glasses off his face. "We could both do with an early night. It's been a hard week." He kissed the tip of her nose. "And where are our brood exactly?" Libby raised 4 fingers. "Away, out, doing homework and watching TV." She folded his glasses and slipped them into their case, whispering, "Even we independent types have need of our menfolk sometimes." Taking hold of his tie, she pulled him towards her side of the table. They kissed, with the slow, unhurried pleasure of mutual familiarity. Later on, in bed, they were rougher and less tender. Perhaps because it was several weeks since they had last found the energy for sex. Perhaps because of some dim connection to the events of the previous week, the need to reassert themselves against the threat of their own mortality. Frances, meanwhile, continued to sit staring at the telephone, puzzling over her longing for interruption from the outside world and the repellence she felt the moment any arrived. Even the television, the most obvious relief for her new solitude, seemed too abrasive a companion for the fragile emptiness of her mind. Not because murders and hospital dramas were in any way upsetting, but because their glib portrayals of emotional states and the subsequent menus of consequences seemed false, flat, and irrelevant. As the days dragged by, it felt increasingly to Frances as if in real life there were no consequences, that she could continue to sit on the sofa forever, with nothing but dull, pointless willpower to trigger the necessity of doing anything else. Her only somewhat surprising release was sleep. The exhaustion of misery was a new discovery, lately even precluding the necessity of Dr. Liam's little white pills. Leaving the dirty coffee mug and the remains of the sandwich she had half eaten by way of supper, Frances dragged herself into a standing position and headed for the stairs. Since she had not moved from the house all day, there was no point in checking locks and bolts. Rereading letters of condolence, one load of washing, on the half-load button. These were her sole achievements of 15 hours. The washing had not even made it onto the line, though she had spent some considerable time staring at the rotary dryer, spinning useless and empty in the brisk autumn breeze. The thought of her underwear and 2 shirts, pegged alone outside, had been too much to bear. She had stuffed them into the tumble dryer instead, guilty at the extravagance of closing the door on so light a load. Chapter 4. 3 weeks later, Frances awoke, as she always did, to a split second of heavenly vacancy before the memory of her new circumstances came flooding in, each time as terrible as the last. Now that it was late September, the bedroom felt unpleasantly chilly in the mornings, a problem which raising the temperature on the thermostat seemed to have gone no way towards solving. The radiators, unused since the beginning of the summer, were lukewarm and full of gurgles. She would have to phone British Gas. The thought even of something so mundane filled her with unreasonable dread. Struggling to an upright position, she took a sip of water and turned on her bedside light. Although it was only 6 o'clock, she felt wide awake, tense at the prospect of another day alone. Next to her alarm clock was a list she had written the night before, a pitiful token gesture at injecting some sense of order into the blankness inside her head. Visit grave. See vicar. Call lawyer. Buy food. Picking up a pen lying beside her water glass, she added, call British Gas, before putting the list down again. Though it was pointless and exhausting, she then allowed herself to cry, reaching for one of Paul's hankies, which she had taken to stowing in her bedside drawer. Since the funeral, she had only visited the graveside once, and derived little solace from the experience. The flowers and wreaths had looked wind-battered and sad. Replacing them with a small arrangement of roses from the garden had generated not comfort, but a sense of futility. Instead of feeling closer to Paul, she had felt, if anything, more removed. There was more intimacy to be had at home, in the faint aroma of aftershave on his dressing gown, in the loop of his handwriting on a letter, or the flyleaf of a book. Not being an adherent to the notion of the life hereafter, Frances accepted that even this sense of proximity would inevitably fade with time, that it did not evince anything beyond the physical remains of what had once been a life. The unwelcome sense of obligation with regard to Reverend Aldridge arose from his having made an impromptu house visit the week before. During the course of a cup of tea and a stale hobnob, he had emitted gentle utterings about the omniscience of God's love and the existence of bereavement support groups. "Help is all around you," he had said, pressing her hand between his palms and peering at her kindly from under the shelf of his grey, bushy eyebrows. "Thank you," Frances had murmured, unable to prevent herself wondering whether the eyebrows grew vertically of their own accord, or were steered that way by their owner out of some misguided sense of vanity. "You are welcome any time at the vicarage, or indeed at St. Martin's. Please call round whenever you want. The Lord's house is for all travellers, whatever their origins or destination." "You mean even if they don't believe in him, and never go to church except for funerals and weddings?" Frances had wanted to say, but didn't because it would have seemed ungrateful and unkind.